So Donald Trump, he's going to beat Nikki Haley. What do you think she's thinking? Why is she still in this race, which looks hopeless?
Well, I think from Nikki Haley's perspective, this race isn't over yet, although certainly the results to date and the delegate allocation rules for those states and Super Tuesday coming up that you mentioned are very daunting for her. But it is not over. In order to become the party's nominee, a candidate has to have over 1,200 delegates allocated to them, which is a process that happens state by state. And Donald Trump hasn't achieved that yet. Now, that may happen very well on Super Tuesday, in all likelihood, probably the week after when there's a couple more states that go.
Yeah.
But until that point, he is not the party's nominee.
Well, okay, that is a statement of literal fact. Of course, he's not the nominee until he is the nominee. But do you see any circumstances? Can you foresee circumstances in which that mantle is snatched away from around his shoulders? Realistically,
no, there's no realistic path to the nomination at this point for Nikki Haley, but that hasn't stopped candidates in the past.
Sure, I get that. So look, when we look at the way things are now, I see it reported that maybe 30 to 40% of Republicans did not vote for Donald Trump in this contest against Nikki Haley, which sounds like maybe a significant minority. And I guess a big question, isn't this right, BJ, turns on how many of those Haley supporters will ultimately simply refuse to back Donald Trump in what could be a tight fight.
Sure. And South Carolina being her home state, I think the math is a little bit different in how some attitudes are. But you have to understand that South Carolina is what we call an open primary state, meaning that you don't have to be a registered Republican in order to participate in a given presidential primary. And in fact, some of the data that's looked from AP Votecast that looked at the results that suggested there were around 16% of voters who said they wouldn't vote for Trump in the general, who were Haley supporters. Many of those, in fact, identify as Democrats or independents, and many of those said in that self-same survey that they were, in fact, Biden voters in 2020. Right. You also look at the general election polling that we are doing in a variety of states and nationally, and you see that the Republican vote, those voters who identify as Republican, are largely lined up behind Trump. So this, I think, is a bit of an aberration, given that it's South Carolina and given that it's an open primary. You're going to see some more voters who say, I'm a Haley unique supporter, but they were never going to vote Trump in the first place, whether or not Haley was there. They voted for Biden last time. They're not accessible to Trump.
Right. Do you believe then there will be any concern in the camp of Donald Trump about those Haley supporters either staying at home in November when the time comes to pick a president, or actually turning around and voting for Joe Biden? Is that something which would keep some of them awake at least some of a particular night?
I don't think anyone in the Trump campaign is losing any sleep over the premise of Haley voters not participating in November. Once we get through this primary process and have a convention and turn to the fall, which November seems like a lifetime away, but it'll be here sooner than we think, voters are going to come down to this binary choice. Now, there's ultimately some third-party alternatives that may appear in a few of the states. But when the choice is voting for Donald Trump or for Joe Biden, many of those Republicans, and there's voters who are independents as well, are going to hold their nose and say, I need to vote for Donald Trump.
Right. Now, what about the various court cases which are hanging over Donald Trump's head like a sword of Damocles? We don't know how they're going to play out yet. And so, therefore, we can't know how the effect of those cases may bear on the mind of voters, in particular those who might vote for Donald Trump. But they can't be helpful. They won't be good for him.
Well, I think it is, in many ways, for Donald Trump, a sword that cuts both ways. When you look at the primary data and how Republicans are viewing these cases, they're more likely to view them as partisan witch hunts. And so regardless of the outcome, Republican voters, if they think that these court cases and various legal snafus that the Trump campaign and Donald Trump himself is embroiled in, if they see this as a partisan attack on Donald Trump, then that only allows them to rally around the candidate even more so. And you've certainly seen that in the primary data. Yeah. I do agree that there, for some independent voters and those swing voters in the fall, it remains to be seen. Some polling questions have asked this very question to some of these independents. They say, oh, it makes me less likely to vote for him if he were convicted of a crime. And that's how they
Yes.
write it. But it really goes back to the premise for any voter is, do I think that he may have been convicted, but in this particular case, when it is actually presented to me and actually happens,
Yes.
my ultimate conclusion, I think that remains to be seen.
Well, indeed. I mean, we know that on both sides, on the red side and the blue side, the Democrat side, the Republican side, there's a base there, a hardcore, that will vote for their man absolutely whatever happens. It is fair, is it, to say that the independents will decide what happens in this presidential campaign, and we can't call that yet. So, in one sense, it is still in the air.
Yeah, there's about 7 states that are going to determine the outcome of the presidential election. And within them, it is the independent vote who are going to really swing each and every one of those states. And even within that segment, I think more importantly, and others have noted this as well, there's a group I call the double haters, some call them the no-nos. They're voters who have an unfavorable view of both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And ultimately, their decision on election day isn't going to be for a candidate that they are excited about voting for. It is going to be voting against a candidate that they really don't want to have. So the key voters in this race come down to a handful of states and come down to a pretty small sliver of the electorate who, as you said, aren't really happy with these choices.
Right. Now, what about, just for a moment, Joe Biden? Because we know in parts of the media, online and in social media, for example, there's more and more talk about Joe Biden losing a bit of ground with his own supporters, about doubts about Joe Biden's age creeping in just a little bit. Do you detect any serious possibility that Joe Biden will listen to that sort of criticism, will decide that maybe he's more of a liability than is good for his party and for America? Not sure what his wife Jill would have to say about all of this, but do you think his house nailed on? Do you think his candidacy is at this point?
There's a lot of what I like to call fan fiction being written by folks about the possibility of someone swooping in to the Democratic convention and Joe Biden being replaced. Barring some significant event, then likely a health event that fundamentally precludes Joe Biden from running, I don't see a scenario under which Joe Biden is not the party's nominee and on the ballot in November.
Yeah, I mean, there's even been some chatter about Michelle Obama. That seems to be more among Republicans than Democrats, but there's no good reason to think that's even remotely likely, is there?
I do think it is a fantasy or a nightmare that some are suggesting, but in terms of reality, no.
All right, BJ Martino, Republican pollster. Great to get your thoughts on this.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here. Now,